My name is Walter Harris. I am 76 years old, and until last spring, I believed I was the last sane person in a family that had quietly gone mad with greed, impatience, and a strange kind of modern cruelty that hides behind polite smiles. I live in a 2-story brick house on the edge of a small town in Pennsylvania, the same house my late wife Margaret and I bought in 1979, when the mortgage rate was 14% and we thought we were making the biggest mistake of our lives. It has peeling white shutters and a porch swing that groans when the wind shifts. Yet for me, it has always been the sound of safety. After Margaret died 6 years ago, I filled my days with the small and orderly things she used to do. Watering the geraniums every Tuesday, folding laundry while the afternoon light poured through the kitchen window, keeping her porcelain teapot polished, even though I mostly drink coffee now. Those routines became a fragile ritual of survival, the only way I could pretend that time had not quietly erased every reason I had for getting out of bed. My daughter Evelyn used to call once a week. At first, she sounded concerned, the way daughters sound when they're halfway between guilt and duty. But over the years, her tone changed. Less warmth, more efficiency, like she was talking to a client whose contract she couldn't quite cancel. She has a husband, Raymond, who runs a small construction firm that's always on the verge of either great success or complete collapse, depending on which version of the story Evelyn tells. They live 40 minutes away, but I see them less than I see the mail carrier. My 2 grandsons, Nate and Oliver, are grown now. One in college, one working somewhere on the West Coast. They stopped visiting after Margaret's funeral. I sometimes wonder if they even remember what my voice sounds like without the filter of a phone connection. Families these days communicate like customer service, short, practical, and only when something is needed. After Margaret's death, Evelyn insisted I stop driving. "Dad, your reflexes aren't what they used to be," she said, though I'd never had an accident in my life. Then came the suggestion of hiring someone to help around the house, just for company. I refused politely the first few times, then firmly, and finally with a kind of icy exhaustion that ended the conversation. What she really wanted, though she never said it aloud, was for me to move into one of those assisted living facilities outside Harrisburg. Bright hallways, artificial smiles, scheduled meals. They have activities, she said, as if I were a child in need of playdates. I told her the house was the last thing keeping me human. She laughed, not unkindly, but with that patronizing chuckle people reserve for the elderly when they've already decided your opinions are a symptom rather than a belief. The last few years were a slow drift of silence. My pension and savings were modest but stable. I had planned carefully. I'd been a high school history teacher for 43 years, the kind who still believed in chalk dust and handwritten essays. I saved every letter my students ever sent me, birthday cards, thank you notes, the occasional Christmas photo, and sometimes, when the nights felt endless, I would take one at random and read it aloud just to hear a young voice in the room again. The house creaked and settled like an old body sighing in sleep, and I took comfort in that familiar loneliness. Until last March, I would have said that solitude, while heavy, was manageable. I thought the world had finally learned to leave me alone. Then Evelyn began visiting more often. At first, it seemed like a pleasant surprise. She brought groceries, rearranged things, took an almost obsessive interest in my medications. She said she was worried about me mixing up the pills, though every bottle was labeled in my own careful handwriting. One Sunday, she arrived with a clipboard and said she wanted to update some records, bank contacts, insurance policies, the house title. I remember the sound of her pen scratching against the paper, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently whenever I hesitated to give an answer. There was something rehearsed in her concern, like she was reciting lines she didn't fully believe. She asked me if I'd ever felt confused lately, or lost track of time, or heard voices when no one was around. I laughed at that, but she didn't. She just looked at me over the rim of her glasses, the way my old principal used to look at students before calling their parents. Around that time, I started receiving strange phone calls from Dr. Nelson, a name I didn't recognize. He said he'd been recommended by my daughter to perform a cognitive wellness check, part of a community program for seniors. His voice was smooth, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. I told him politely that I was fine and didn't need any evaluation, but he insisted it was just routine, nothing intrusive. I forgot about him until 2 weeks later, when Evelyn appeared unannounced on a gray Thursday afternoon with that same Dr. Nelson in tow. She introduced him as Dad's new physician, though I already had one, Dr. Simons, who'd been treating me for a decade. Nelson smiled too much, his teeth too even, his handshake too quick. He asked a few simple questions: what day it was, who the president was. Could I recall a short list of words he'd just said? It all felt absurd. When I asked for his credentials, he chuckled and said, "Oh, your daughter's already verified everything." That should have been my first alarm. After they left, I found Evelyn had tidied up my study. But tidied wasn't the right word. She'd removed things: my checkbook, a folder with property documents, Margaret's old jewelry box. When I called her about it, she claimed she'd taken the papers for safekeeping. I felt the cold pressure of unease settle in my chest, but I told myself she was only trying to help. Children worry, they meddle, they make mistakes. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my armchair listening to the refrigerator hum, staring at the half-open door of Margaret's sewing room. Her scent was long gone, but the habit of missing her had become my second skin. I whispered aloud, "If you were here, Maggie, you'd know what to do." But the house only answered with silence. The following week, a letter arrived from my bank asking me to confirm a power of attorney form they'd received, allegedly signed by me. My hands trembled as I read the photocopy. My signature was there, but skewed, uneven, forged with unsettling accuracy. I drove to the bank the next morning, my first drive in months, and they froze the account until the matter could be clarified. When I called Evelyn to confront her, she sounded offended, almost wounded, insisting she only wanted to make sure everything was in order if something happened to me. Her words struck deeper than she intended. If something happened to me. It sounded less like concern and more like a schedule. I tried to rationalize, to believe that families sometimes stumble through moments of mistrust. But the rhythm of her visits became more coordinated, as if each one were part of a plan. She brought strangers, social workers, volunteers, a young woman with a clipboard who asked how often I left the house, whether I still remembered to eat, whether I'd ever considered harming myself. Every answer I gave seemed to twist into another question, each one implying that perhaps I wasn't as competent as I thought. I began to feel like an insect pinned beneath a magnifying glass. My every movement watched, recorded, interpreted. The worst part wasn't their suspicion. It was the slow erosion of my own certainty. When enough people tell you you're confused, you start to question whether maybe you are. One evening, I opened the mail to find a medical notice, an appointment confirmation for a psychiatric assessment at a clinic I'd never heard of. It was signed by Dr. Nelson. I called the number listed, but the receptionist said the appointment had already been approved by my primary guardian. I hung up slowly, realizing what those words meant. My daughter was building a case, quietly, meticulously, so that one day she could walk into a courtroom and declare that her father was no longer fit to manage his life. Maybe she thought she was protecting me. More likely, she was protecting her access to my estate. In any case, she underestimated one thing: my memory. I had spent a lifetime teaching history, and history above all is about recognizing patterns. The pattern I saw forming around me was one of quiet dispossession. Still, I wanted to believe in her better nature. I told myself she was under stress, that her husband's business troubles had made her desperate, that she wasn't truly capable of betrayal. But denial, I have learned, is a soft blanket that slowly suffocates you. The last peaceful night I remember was a Sunday in late April. The sky was full of rain that never quite fell, and I sat by the window watching the lightning flicker like ghosts on the horizon. I made tea in Margaret's cup, the one with the faint crack along the rim, and told myself that tomorrow I would call a lawyer, just in case. Tomorrow came faster than I expected, and with it, the moment when my daughter arrived, not as family, but as something colder, armed with a smile, a clipboard, and a stranger who called himself doctor. It happened on a Wednesday that started like any other, quiet, gray, harmless. I had just finished breakfast and was sitting in my armchair reading the local newspaper when I heard a car door slam outside. I looked through the window and saw Evelyn stepping out, her posture stiff, her movements hurried, and behind her that same man, Dr. Nelson, carrying a black leather briefcase. For a moment, I thought about locking the door and pretending I wasn't home, but something in me wanted to face whatever game she was playing. When they knocked, I opened the door, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Evelyn greeted me with a brightness that felt rehearsed, saying they were only there to finish a few formalities concerning my health insurance. Dr. Nelson nodded as if confirming a business deal rather than a medical visit. They entered without waiting for an invitation, the way people do when they already believe the place belongs to them. He asked to speak with me privately for a few minutes, and Evelyn agreed, stepping into the kitchen where I could hear her making phone calls. Dr. Nelson sat across from me in the living room, his gaze sliding over my bookshelves, the photographs, the framed certificate from my teaching years. "Mr. Harris," he began smoothly, "your daughter is concerned. She's noticed some changes in your behavior: forgetfulness, irritability, possible confusion." I interrupted him sharply, saying I was perfectly capable of managing my own life. He nodded sympathetically, the way doctors do when they've already decided on the diagnosis. He pulled out a clipboard, asked me to repeat a sequence of numbers backward, to name the current president, to identify the day of the week. I answered everything correctly, but he kept writing notes with small, deliberate pauses as if my accuracy only made his suspicion deeper. When he asked whether I ever felt watched or controlled, I almost laughed at the irony. I told him yes, by him and by my daughter. He didn't find it amusing. Then came the paper. He unfolded it slowly, the way a magician reveals a trick, and said it was a standard assessment authorization form, allowing him to conduct a temporary mental health evaluation. It meant, he explained, a short observation period, 72 hours in a private facility where they could ensure my safety and well-being. I pushed the paper back toward him. "No," I said, "I'm not signing anything." He nodded again, still calm, and said, "That's perfectly fine. In that case, your daughter has already provided legal consent on your behalf." I stared at him, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "On my behalf?" He smiled apologetically and said something about emergency guardianship protocols, senior welfare protection, the kind of bureaucratic jargon that sounds harmless until you realize it's a cage. Evelyn returned, holding her phone, avoiding my eyes. 2 men in plain clothes were waiting outside. Orderlies or security officers, I couldn't tell. When I demanded to know what was happening, she said, almost whispering, "Dad, please, don't make this harder. It's for your own good." I felt the room tilt slightly, not from age or illness, but from the realization that my daughter had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I tried to grab my coat, but one of the men gently took it from my hand. "It'll just be a few days, sir," he said in a voice too calm, too practiced. They guided me out to the car, ignoring my protests. I saw my neighbors watching from across the street, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and pity. No one intervened. No one ever does when madness is the excuse. The ride was long and silent. Evelyn followed behind us in her own car. Through the tinted window, I saw familiar streets blur into anonymous highway signs, each one pulling me further from the life I recognized. The facility was a squat concrete building an hour away, surrounded by a high fence and neatly trimmed hedges that tried to disguise their purpose. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic. A woman at the front desk greeted us with a professional smile and said, "Welcome, Mr. Harris. We've been expecting you." The phrase struck me as obscene, as if my imprisonment had been on a calendar somewhere. I tried to tell her there had been a mistake, that I wasn't sick, that I was being tricked. She only nodded politely and asked me to remove my belt and shoelaces for safety reasons. They led me to a small room with a narrow bed, a single window sealed shut, and a camera in the corner disguised as a smoke detector. The walls were pale blue, the kind of color meant to calm people who had already been broken. They took my watch and wallet, leaving me with the clothes I wore and a wristband bearing my name and a patient number. The door locked with a soft electronic click that sounded far louder than any slam. For the first hour, I sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for someone reasonable to arrive, someone who would see this absurdity for what it was. No one came. Only the orderly brought me a tray with food I couldn't bring myself to touch. That night I tried to sleep, but every noise in the corridor kept me awake. The shuffling of slippers, the hiss of automatic doors, the occasional murmur of someone crying. I thought of Margaret's face, the warmth of her voice when she'd tell me to let go of anger before it poisons you. I tried, but anger was the only thing keeping me sane. Around midnight, the nurse on duty peeked in, asked if I was comfortable, and then wrote something in her tablet after I said I wanted to call my lawyer. "All communications are restricted until your attending physician approves it," she replied. I asked when that would be. "He'll see you tomorrow morning," she said, and left before I could ask another question. The next day, Dr. Nelson appeared again, now wearing a white coat with the clinic's emblem embroidered on the pocket. He looked perfectly at ease, as if the previous day's deception had been nothing more than paperwork. He sat down across from me, legs crossed, and asked if I knew why I was there. I told him I knew exactly why. Because my daughter wanted to control everything I had left. He sighed theatrically, said he understood that paranoia was often part of late-onset cognitive decline, and scribbled more notes. I wanted to leap across the table and tear that clipboard out of his hands, but I kept my composure. I asked him directly if he was a licensed psychiatrist. He smiled and said, "Of course." I didn't believe him, but I had no proof, only instinct. Later that day, Evelyn came to visit. They made me meet her in a supervised room with a camera pointed directly at my face. She brought a paper bag with fruit and clean clothes, speaking softly, as though afraid I might shatter. "Dad, please cooperate," she said. "This is temporary. You need rest." I asked her whether she'd forged my signature on the bank documents. She froze for a fraction of a second, then said, "You're remembering things wrong again." I laughed bitterly, realizing that she had weaponized the one weakness old age gives you, doubt. She stood up to leave, kissed my forehead like one might kiss a sleeping patient, and whispered, "Just trust me." Then she walked out, leaving behind the faint smell of her perfume and the echo of betrayal. The second night was worse. I began to hear footsteps outside my room that stopped just beyond the door, as if someone were listening. When I called out, no one answered. I pressed the call button and waited, but the nurse took 15 minutes to appear. She smiled blankly and said, "Everything's fine, Mr. Harris. You must have been dreaming." But I hadn't. I was fully awake, counting the seconds between each step. Around 3 in the morning, I noticed a flicker of movement in the hallway through the small window in my door. Oh, a man passing by in scrubs, his head turned toward me. For a brief second, I thought it was Nelson again. But then the man looked directly into the window, and I saw something different in his eyes. Not cold detachment, but recognition. He hesitated, pressed a finger to his lips in a gesture of silence, and walked away. I didn't understand then what that meant, but later I would realize that this was the moment everything began to shift, the first crack in the wall they had built around me. By the third day, I was losing my sense of time. Meals came and went. The lights dimmed automatically, and the voices of other patients drifted through the vents like fragments of someone else's nightmare. I kept rehearsing what I would say when they finally let me speak to an attorney, but part of me feared that by then it would be too late, that Evelyn would have already filed the petition, that my home and accounts would be beyond my reach. Yet amid that fear, a single thought burned steady. I would get out. Not because I had faith in the system or mercy in my daughter, but because I still knew who I was, and that was something they couldn't diagnose away. And so, when the door finally opened on the morning of the third day, and a man entered wearing the same white coat as the rest, clipboard in hand, I was ready to fight again, until he lifted his eyes and I realized he wasn't Dr. Nelson at all. He was someone I had seen before, someone who was about to tell me a truth I could never have imagined. The man who entered my room on that third morning looked like every other physician in the ward. Same pale blue scrubs, same clipped steps that made no sound, same clipboard held like a shield between himself and the patient. Yet something in the way he moved, the quick, assessing glance that lingered not on me, but on the corners of the ceiling, the vents, the door frame, told me that this was not another routine evaluation. He closed the door softly behind him, set the clipboard on the table, and said in a low voice that barely carried across the room, "Mr. Harris, my name is Dr. Franklin. I'll be taking over your case today." I studied his face. Clean-shaven, maybe in his 40s, a streak of gray at the temples, and something flickered in the back of my mind. A half-memory of a newspaper article, or a face glimpsed in a different context. Before I could place it, he had already pulled up the chair and begun flipping through a stack of papers, pretending to read. After a moment he spoke again, his tone shifting subtly. "You don't remember me, do you?" I frowned, searching my memory. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "It's Harry Finn. You sent me a letter in February." The name struck me like an electrical shock. 6 months earlier, I had written to an attorney recommended by an old colleague, a quiet man known for handling elder law cases discreetly. I had wanted advice about protecting my estate from potential misuse, though at the time it felt paranoid even to consider that my own daughter could pose such a risk. Harry Finn had replied by mail, suggesting a preliminary review of my documents and advising that I keep the communication private until he completed background checks. After that, I'd heard nothing, and with each passing week, I convinced myself the whole idea had been unnecessary. And now he was sitting in front of me, wearing a fake badge and the uniform of a psychiatrist, speaking to me in a whisper, like a conspirator in a spy novel. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions at once, but he raised a hand. "Not now," he said quietly. "They're monitoring everything. We have 5 minutes before the nurse makes her first check. Just listen." He explained that after receiving my initial letter, he had started investigating the legal trail surrounding my property and bank accounts. He had discovered that Evelyn had forged documents transferring partial authority over my finances and had been preparing to file a petition declaring me mentally unfit. The fabricated doctor's report I had glimpsed was part of her evidence. He had tried to contact me in March, but learned that she had intercepted my mail. When she scheduled this psychiatric evaluation, he realized she might attempt something drastic. "I had to get inside," he said simply. "So I applied for temporary employment under a clinical consultant license. It was easier than you'd think." His mouth twitched with grim amusement. "I wanted to see what they were doing to you." For a moment, disbelief and relief battled inside me. The absurdity of it, an attorney pretending to be a doctor, infiltrating a mental ward, should have sounded insane. Yet it was the only thing that made sense. "Can you get me out?" I asked. He nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "Yes, but we have to do it properly. If we make one wrong move, they'll call it an episode, and you'll end up committed for real. Evelyn has already filed the petition. The hearing is in 2 days. We need you there in person to contest it. I've prepared a motion for emergency release, but I need you to stay calm and appear cooperative until I file it." I told him I would do whatever he asked, though the thought of playing docile while my daughter dismantled my life felt unbearable. He leaned closer, resting his elbows on his knees. "They think you're broken, Walter. That's your advantage. Use it." When he left, he pressed a folded paper into my palm, no larger than a business card. "Hide it," he whispered. It was a list of instructions written in tiny handwriting. "Do not argue. Observe everything. Tonight there will be a fire alarm. Follow the nurse in gray shoes. Trust only her." The paper burned like a secret in my pocket. I spent the rest of the day trying to appear compliant, answering questions blandly, even pretending mild confusion when Dr. Nelson returned for his evaluation. Nelson seemed satisfied with my meekness. He asked if I still felt paranoid about my daughter. I smiled and said I must have misunderstood her intentions. He made a note, looking pleased, and told me I was making progress. I wanted to spit in his face. Instead, I thanked him. By evening, the ward had settled into its eerie rhythm. The same hum of lights, the same distant groans from other rooms, the same mechanical voice over the intercom announcing medication times. I kept glancing at the clock, wondering when the fire alarm would come. Every creak of the corridor made my pulse jump. Around 11, I heard the faint clang of metal from somewhere down the hall, followed by a shrill, stuttering alarm that filled the building with flashing red light. The patients began shouting, doors opened, and nurses hurried in every direction. Amid the chaos, I spotted her, the nurse with gray shoes and a ponytail, moving briskly, her expression calm. She reached my door, unlocked it, and said in a low voice, "Mr. Harris, come with me, quickly." I followed without hesitation. She led me down a service corridor that smelled of disinfectant, through an unmarked door, and into a stairwell dimly lit by emergency bulbs. "This way," she said, taking my arm firmly but gently. "We have 10 minutes before they reset the alarm." We descended 2 flights, emerging into what looked like a supply basement. There, behind a row of industrial washing machines, stood Harry Finn, now dressed in ordinary clothes. He handed me a coat and a set of papers. "Emergency release order," he said. "Filed under medical transfer. It will hold long enough for us to reach the courthouse." The nurse, whose name I never learned, nodded once, pressed a security badge into his hand, and disappeared back up the stairs without a word. I wanted to thank her, but she was already gone. We slipped out through a side door into the cold night air. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars gleaming under the security lights. Harry led me to a nondescript gray sedan. "Get in," he said. "Don't look back." I obeyed. The drive was a blur of headlights and silence. I kept waiting for police sirens, for a call from the clinic, for some sign that our escape had triggered alarms. But the night remained eerily still. Harry kept both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road. "You'll need to prepare yourself," he said after a while. "Evelyn's lawyers will be ruthless. They'll try to discredit you completely. She's already submitted testimony claiming you've been hallucinating, that you accused her of theft without evidence, that you're suffering from early dementia. I've gathered enough counter-evidence to challenge it, but your demeanor tomorrow will decide everything. You must remain calm no matter what she says." I told him I understood, though inside I was seething. The thought that my own daughter had rehearsed my madness in front of strangers, had planned every step of my humiliation, made my stomach turn. We reached a small motel on the outskirts of the city just before dawn. Harry checked in under a false name, and once we were inside the room, he finally allowed himself to exhale. "We're safe for now," he said, dropping into the chair by the window. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the first real wave of exhaustion crash over me. He handed me a file folder. "These are copies of the forged documents, your signature on the power of attorney, the medical statement from Nelson, and the petition draft. I'll present them in court as evidence of fraud and unlawful detention." I leafed through the pages, each one confirming my worst fears. The signatures were perfect imitations. Even the notary seal looked authentic. I asked how she had managed to pull it off. "She had help," he said grimly. "Nelson isn't a doctor. He's a licensed therapist with disciplinary suspensions in 2 states. She paid him to falsify the evaluation." I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the printed lies that nearly erased my life. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me since the moment she walked into my house with that stranger. "Why would she do this, Harry? She doesn't need the money. I gave her everything she ever asked for." He shrugged slowly. "It's rarely about need. It's about control, about proving that they can take something from you and make you thank them for it." His words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the first thin light of the morning crept across the parking lot. Somewhere in that fragile dawn, I felt the old version of myself, the quiet, patient father who believed in family above all, finally begin to die. What remained was a man who would no longer plead for affection, who would rather burn everything than be quietly erased. As I lay awake that morning, the motel air conditioner rattling softly beside me, I realized that the real battle had only just begun. Escaping the clinic was only the first step. Now I would have to reclaim my name, my sanity, and my freedom before my own daughter buried them under legal paper. I stared at the ceiling until the light turned gold and told myself that I would walk into that courtroom not as a victim, but as a witness, carrying every scar she had given me as proof that I was still very much alive. The morning of the hearing began in a haze of gray light filtering through the thin motel curtains, and for a long time I lay still, listening to the distant hum of traffic on the highway, trying to remind myself that I was free, that the door was unlocked, that no one could take me back to that room with the sealed window and the camera in the corner. But freedom, I discovered, doesn't arrive as a moment of triumph. It creeps in cautiously, disguised as fear. Harry Finn sat at the small desk, reading through a thick stack of papers while stirring instant coffee with a hotel pen. He looked calm, methodical, but I could see the tension in the way his jaw tightened every few seconds. "You'll need to speak clearly," he said without looking up. "Don't sound angry, even if you have every right to be. Judges don't like passion, they like control. Keep your story factual, consistent, unshaken." I nodded, though my throat was dry, and it occurred to me that I had spent most of my adult life teaching young people how to stay composed under pressure. Now I was the one being graded. The courthouse was a squat red brick building in the center of town, its steps slick with drizzle, its flag drooping in the damp air. As we approached, Harry handed me a folder with neatly clipped documents. "These are your medical records and the report from Dr. Simons confirming you're mentally competent. Nelson's credentials were revoked 2 years ago. That will help us. But Evelyn will be there, and she'll be coached. She's smart, articulate, emotional when she needs to be. Don't let her pull you back into the role of the guilty father." I told him I would try, though the thought of facing her made my chest ache, in a way no doctor could measure. Inside the courtroom, the air smelled faintly of varnish and coffee. A handful of people sat in the back rows, clerks, other petitioners, maybe reporters. When Evelyn entered, I felt time collapse. She wore a navy blue suit, her hair pulled into a severe knot, her face pale but composed. For a brief moment she looked at me, and I saw no trace of remorse, only determination. The judge, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, began by asking the attorneys to state their cases. Evelyn's lawyer, a slick man with silver cufflinks and a voice trained for persuasion, stood first. He painted a portrait of a declining old man, isolated, forgetful, paranoid, prone to angry outbursts. He spoke about the safety concerns of leaving me unsupervised, about the loving daughter, forced to take difficult measures for her father's well-being. Each sentence was a dagger wrapped in velvet. I sat perfectly still, my hands clasped on the table, and thought of how many times I'd lectured my students about propaganda, the way truth can be murdered by tone alone. When he finished, Harry rose calmly, his presence quiet but unmistakably solid. He spoke of fraud, of forged signatures, of unlawful detention, of a supposed doctor who was not a doctor at all. He presented the bank's confirmation that I had reported unauthorized activity and the clinic's internal record showing no verified consent from me. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The truth has its own volume. Then it was my turn. The judge asked me to stand and describe the events leading up to my commitment. My voice trembled at first, but as I began recounting each detail, the forged form, the men who escorted me from my house, the locked door, the camera, the fabricated kindness of my daughter, something steadied inside me. I had lived it, endured it, survived it. The words came like a current that had waited too long to flow. I told the court how I had trusted my daughter, how her concern had turned to surveillance, how she had manipulated the language of care into a mechanism of control. When I finished, the courtroom was silent except for the judge tapping her pen against the desk. Evelyn avoided my gaze. The lawyer beside her whispered something, and she nodded, then took the stand. Her performance was perfect. She spoke softly, her voice breaking in just the right places, describing how she'd found me disoriented and talking to myself, how she feared I would harm myself after my wife's death, how I had become obsessed with imaginary thefts. She looked at the judge through a thin veil of tears and said, "I only wanted to protect my father." It was almost convincing, even to me. For a moment, I caught myself doubting my own certainty, wondering if perhaps grief had warped my memory, if maybe I had seemed unwell, if maybe all this madness had been a misunderstanding. Then Harry placed a quiet hand on my shoulder and handed the judge a sheet of paper. "Your Honor," he said, "this is a notarized report from Dr. Simons, Mr. Harris's primary physician of 10 years, confirming no cognitive impairment whatsoever. And this," he raised another document, "is a disciplinary report from the State Board confirming that Dr. Nelson, whom the petitioner hired, has been suspended for falsifying evaluations in exchange for payment. We also have financial statements showing attempted unauthorized transfers from Mr. Harris's account during the week of his confinement." The judge read silently, her expression flattening. Evelyn's lawyer objected, claiming the documents were irrelevant to the issue of guardianship, but she silenced him with a raised hand. "Sit down, counselor," she said, and for the first time I allowed myself to breathe. After several tense minutes, the judge announced a temporary dismissal to review the evidence in private chambers. Evelyn and I remained seated, separated by an aisle that felt wider than any distance I'd ever known. She kept her eyes on her phone, scrolling, her fingers trembling just slightly. I wanted to ask her why she couldn't have waited, why she needed to win so completely. But there was nothing left to say. When the judge returned, her verdict was brief but decisive. "Based on the evidence provided," she said, "the court finds insufficient grounds to grant guardianship to the petitioner. Furthermore, the court refers the matter of false documentation to the district attorney's office for review." The gavel fell like a final breath. Evelyn's lawyer muttered something under his breath. She stood motionless, lips parted, eyes wide with disbelief. I didn't look at her again. Harry gathered the papers, nodded at me, and whispered, "It's over. For now." But I knew better. Nothing that deep ever ends in a courtroom. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and shining. We walked in silence toward the car. My body felt heavy, as if the air itself resisted each step. I thought victory would feel clean, liberating, but it didn't. It felt like walking away from a burning house, knowing your name would always smell faintly of smoke. Harry stopped by the car and turned to me. "You should stay somewhere else for a while. She's not finished. I've seen this pattern before. When control fails, resentment takes its place. She'll come after you again, maybe through the media, maybe through the bank, maybe something smaller, pettier. Just be ready." I told him I was tired, that I wanted to go home. "Home," he said quietly, "might not feel like home anymore." He was right. When I returned that evening, the house felt hollow, violated. Every object seemed to carry a question. Had she touched this? Had she planned this moment here? I sat at the kitchen table where Margaret used to read her magazines, and for the first time I spoke to her aloud, not as memory, but as if she were sitting across from me. "You were right about Evelyn," I said. "You always said she had your will, but not your heart." The refrigerator hummed in response. I poured a glass of water and stared at my reflection in the window, the tired face, the thinning hair, the faint tremor in my hand, and realized how close I had come to disappearing. Later that night, Harry called to tell me the press might get wind of the case, that we should prepare a statement. I told him to write whatever he wanted, as long as it was truthful. He laughed softly. "You're the calmest man I've ever seen after nearly being institutionalized." "No," I said, "I'm just empty." And that was true. The fury had burned itself out, leaving behind something quieter and colder, a kind of clarity that felt almost sacred. I understood now that what Evelyn had done was not an accident or a lapse of judgment. It was a choice made long before the first signature was forged. It had been waiting beneath every polite conversation, every carefully measured tone of concern, every perfumed hug that lasted just a second too long. When I went to bed, the rain began again, soft and steady, and as I listened to it, I thought about the strange mercy of being forced to see the truth. For years I had lived inside the illusion of family, convincing myself that love was stronger than greed, that gratitude could be inherited like a name. Now I knew better. Love, I realized, is only sacred when it's chosen freely, not when it's demanded out of obligation. I fell asleep with that thought and woke at dawn feeling lighter, though I couldn't have said why. Outside, the world looked unchanged. The same gray clouds, the same crooked fence, the same mourning dove cooing on the telephone wire. But something inside me had shifted. The past no longer held me hostage, and for the first time in a long while, the future, however uncertain, felt like mine again. For a few weeks after the hearing, silence settled over my life, like a heavy fog that promised peace, but carried the taste of something unfinished. The newspapers never printed my name, though one local column hinted at a disputed guardianship case involving falsified medical reports, and people in town drew their own conclusions. The neighbors were polite but watchful, pretending not to stare when I fetched the mail or trimmed the hedges. I didn't blame them. Scandal, even a faint one, has a smell that seeps into the soil. I tried to return to a semblance of routine. Morning coffee, crosswords, reading. But routine no longer brought comfort. Each time the phone rang, I half expected Evelyn's voice on the other end, soft and poisonous, ready to twist the knife of guilt. For a time she didn't call at all, which was worse. The absence of her voice became a presence of its own, a ghost pacing the edges of my thoughts. Then, one Thursday afternoon, a letter arrived. It was typed, formal, addressed not to me, but to the estate of Walter Harris. I held it in my hands for a long moment before opening it, my heart thudding like it used to before a difficult exam in my teaching days. Inside was a single page from a law firm I didn't recognize, informing me that Evelyn had initiated a civil suit claiming damages for emotional distress and defamation resulting from her father's false accusations. I read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe how precisely she had inverted the truth. She had learned the trick of turning cruelty into victimhood, and she wore it now like armor. I called Harry immediately. He didn't sound surprised. "I told you she wasn't done," he said quietly. "People like your daughter don't retreat. They regroup. But don't worry, it's mostly intimidation. She doesn't have a case." I wanted to believe him, but something in his voice told me he wasn't entirely sure. The next few days blurred into a slow erosion of peace. Strange things began happening, small, deliberate, impossible to prove. My mailbox was left open in the rain. The garbage cans were knocked over in the night. Someone sprayed an ugly word on my fence and painted over it, before I noticed, leaving a faint gray scar. I saw a car I didn't recognize parked near the end of the street several evenings in a row. Sometimes, when I picked up the phone, there was only breathing on the other end, followed by a click. It might have been paranoia, but after everything I'd lived through, paranoia felt like self-defense. One night I thought I saw a shadow move across the porch window, but when I turned on the light, there was nothing. I told Harry about it, and he offered to install security cameras. I agreed, though I hated the idea of turning my home into another monitored cell. The difference, he said, was that this time I would be the one watching. A week later, he came by with a technician to set them up, small black lenses above the doors in the hallway near the garage. As they worked, Harry talked about the lawsuit, about the slow machinery of the legal system, about the likelihood that Evelyn would drop the claim once she realized she couldn't win. But even he seemed unsettled. "She's changed lawyers twice already," he said, flipping through his notes. "That usually means strategy, not confusion." He paused, then looked at me. "Walter, if anything feels off, anything at all, you call me, day or night." I promised I would. He left around dusk, and for the first time since the trial, I felt something like gratitude, not for justice, which is too fragile a word, but for companionship, the kind that doesn't demand affection, only presence. The next morning I found an envelope wedged under my front door. No return address, just my name in Evelyn's handwriting. Inside was a photograph. It showed me sitting on my porch 2 days earlier, reading a book, unaware. On the back, she had written, "You can't hide from family, Dad." My hands began to shake. It wasn't the threat itself that terrified me. It was the intimacy of it, the proof that she had been close, that she had stood somewhere out there watching. I called Harry again, my voice unsteady, and he told me to bring the photo to his office immediately. I drove there within the hour, clutching the envelope like evidence from a crime scene. He examined it carefully, nodding. "This changes things," he said. "She's crossed into harassment. I can file a restraining order." But as he spoke, his voice sounded oddly distant, as if part of him were already considering a larger picture I couldn't see. That night I couldn't sleep. The cameras blinked faintly in the dark, recording everything, my restlessness, the slow pacing of an old man who no longer trusted his walls. Around midnight, a motion alert buzzed on the monitor beside my bed. A figure moved near the garage. I held my breath, watching the grainy image of a shadow approaching the side window. The figure crouched, seemed to tamper with something, then froze, staring straight into the lens before retreating into the darkness. I didn't see a face, but the posture, the outline of the shoulders. It was her. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the yard was empty. They found no footprints, no forced entry, nothing. One of the officers, young enough to be my grandson, patted my shoulder and said gently, "Maybe it was just a raccoon, sir." I almost laughed. If only raccoons knew how to type legal threats. Over the next week, the pressure intensified. Someone filed a complaint with the city claiming my property was unsafe and unsanitary. A health inspector showed up unannounced, took photographs, and left without explanation. My power went out twice in 1 week. The utility company said the outages were localized, but I noticed the lines near my house had been recently tampered with. Harry urged me to stay with a friend or check into a hotel, but I refused. "This is my home," I said. "If I leave, she wins." He didn't argue, though his eyes said he thought I was being foolish. Maybe I was. Yet something inside me had hardened. I had been locked away once in a place that pretended to protect me. I wouldn't exile myself voluntarily again. Then one afternoon, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Evelyn stood there, calm, composed, as if none of it had ever happened. She wore a beige coat and held a folder in her hands. "Dad," she said softly, "can we talk?" For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one who had signed my sanity away. Her expression was gentle, almost pleading. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. She entered slowly, looking around as if reacquainting herself with a museum exhibit. "It hasn't changed much," she said. I told her to say what she came to say. She sighed, opened the folder, and produced a stack of papers. "I want to end this," she said. "All of it. The lawsuit, the fighting, the distance. We can settle quietly if you just agree to sign over power of attorney for financial matters. Temporarily, just until everything stabilizes." I laughed then, a harsh sound that startled even me. Temporarily, I repeated. You've always been good with words, Evelyn. You can make a cage sound like a gift. Her face tightened. I'm trying to help you. You're making yourself look unstable again. Harry's exploiting you. Don't you see that? The accusation hit me like a slap. Exploiting me? He risked his career to get me out of that clinic. She shook her head. That's what he told you. But do you even know who he is, really? Did you check his credentials? Because I did. And they're not as clean as you think. Her tone was smooth, persuasive, almost maternal. For a flicker of a moment, doubt stirred in me, the way an old wound throbs when touched. But I forced it down. You've lied about everything else, I said. Why stop now? She stared at me, eyes glistening, and whispered, I'm your daughter. I replied quietly, Yes, and that used to mean something. She turned sharply, gathering her papers. You'll regret this, she said. When the court sees what kind of influence he has over you, they'll take you seriously again. You can't fight everyone forever. Then she left, the door closing softly behind her. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space she'd occupied, feeling both hollow and furious. That night, I searched Harry's name online for the first time, partly to reassure myself, partly to confront the tiny seed of doubt she had planted. The search results were mostly dry. Legal listings, firm websites, but buried among them was an old news article. Local attorney suspended for ethical violations, 2013. My stomach clenched. It was the same name, the same city, though the details were vague. I called him immediately. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm but weary. I told him what I'd found. There was a pause, then he said, Yes, it's true. It was a long time ago. A disciplinary review over a conflict of interest case. I was cleared, but the suspension stayed on record. I should have told you. I sat in silence, unsure whether to feel betrayed or ashamed for doubting him. Walter, he said gently, whatever mistakes I made then, I didn't make them with you. Don't let her twist this. I said I believed him, though the certainty in my voice sounded thinner than before. The following day, I received another letter, this one hand-delivered with no postage. Inside was a copy of that same article, highlighted in yellow, with a note in Evelyn's handwriting. He's using you, just like everyone else. I tore it to shreds, but her words clung to my thoughts. That night I dreamed of Margaret again, standing at the end of the hallway, calling my name. When I reached her, she turned into Evelyn, holding a blank sheet of paper that dissolved into smoke. I woke drenched in sweat, the cameras blinking silently around me, recording a man trapped between two versions of the same betrayal. 2 days later, the inevitable confrontation came. I was driving back from the grocery store when a black SUV swerved in front of me, forcing me to brake. The driver's door opened. It was Evelyn. She walked up to my window, eyes wild, voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" she shouted. "You think you're the victim, but you're not. You're destroying what's left of this family." I rolled the window down an inch, keeping my tone calm. "You destroyed it yourself." She slammed her hand against the glass. "I loved you," she screamed. "I did everything for you." Then her expression changed, the fury melting into something like despair. "Please, Dad, just come home with me. We can fix this." I looked at her, really looked, and saw a woman who had built her life on control and now stood in the ruins of it, unable to understand that love and possession are not the same thing. "No," I said softly. "It's time you fix yourself." I drove away, leaving her standing in the road, small and furious and lost. That night I sat in my armchair, the house silent except for the ticking clock. I thought about how love can curdle when it's mixed with entitlement, how family can become a mirror of one's worst impulses. I realized that Evelyn's cruelty wasn't born from hatred, but from fear, the fear of losing relevance, of facing the void without someone to manage. And I, in my weakness, had allowed her to feed on that fear for years. The cameras recorded me sitting there for hours, motionless, a man surrounded by proof of everything he no longer trusted. At midnight, Harry called to tell me the restraining order had been approved. "You're safe now," he said. I thanked him, though we both knew safety was just another illusion. Some wounds don't heal. They just learn to hide beneath the skin, waiting for the next tremor to remind you they're still alive. When I finally went to bed, dawn was already creeping through the blinds. I thought of Margaret's favorite saying, "Nothing dies properly when it's loved the wrong way." Evelyn's face hovered in my mind, and for the first time, I felt not anger, but pity. She would wake tomorrow and find herself surrounded by victories that meant nothing, by walls built from the ashes of affection. I had lost my daughter long before the trial. I had simply refused to admit it. Now, as the first light touched the photographs on the dresser, I understood that every act of cruelty she'd inflicted was an echo of something broken long ago, something neither of us could fix. It was the night after the confrontation on the road, when everything finally reached its breaking point. The sky was bruised with heavy clouds, and the air felt thick enough to drink. I had left all the lights on in the house, not out of fear exactly, but because darkness had begun to feel like her domain. The restraining order sat folded on the kitchen table, beside a cup of untouched tea, and for hours I paced between the rooms, unable to quiet the tremor of anticipation that always precedes disaster. Around midnight, the wind began to rise, rattling the windows, and I caught myself listening for footsteps that weren't there. I had lived through so many nights of suspicion that even silence now carried the texture of threat. Then, just as I started to convince myself that the storm would pass uneventfully, I heard a sound, a low metallic scrape from the back door, followed by the soft, unmistakable click of a lock being tested. My heart lurched. I moved to the kitchen slowly, every muscle tight, and saw the doorknob twitch once, twice. Someone was outside. I turned off the lights, grabbed the phone, and crouched by the counter. But before I could dial, the door swung open with a groan of hinges. A silhouette stepped inside, outlined by the faint glow of lightning. It was Evelyn. Her coat was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, and in her hands she held a stack of papers wrapped in a plastic sleeve. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling, "please don't call anyone. I just need to talk." I stayed still, my breath shallow, waiting for anger to rise in me. But what I felt instead was a deep, exhausted sorrow. She closed the door behind her and stood dripping on the tile. "I didn't come to hurt you," she said. "I swear. I just need you to listen." She laid the papers on the counter, her hands shaking. "These are the new documents," she said. "I withdrew the lawsuit. I told them I don't want anything from you anymore. But you have to understand why I did all this." She took a step forward, and I saw in her eyes a desperation that looked almost like confession. "You were disappearing," she said. "After Mom died, you just stopped living. You never called, never went out, never cared about anything. I thought if I could take control, if I could manage things, you'd be forced to fight, to feel something again. I never wanted to destroy you. I wanted to wake you up." I stared at her, unable to speak. The rain hammered the windows like a second heartbeat. "Wake me up," I finally said. "You locked me in a hospital. You forged my name. You turned the world against me." Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who would run to me with scraped knees, seeking forgiveness before I even knew what she'd done. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I see that now. But you have to forgive me. You're all I have left." She reached for my hand, and for a second, I almost let her touch me. Then I saw the glint of a small recorder half hidden in her sleeve. It was instinct more than logic that made me pull away. I reached out, grabbed her wrist, and the recorder fell to the floor with a clatter. Her eyes widened, and she bent to snatch it up, but I was faster. I picked it up and hit play. My own voice filled the room. Fragments of sentences, taken from our last conversation at the door, spliced together to sound like a confession of confusion, guilt, even instability. She had been recording me all along, building another case, another trap. "You never learn," I said quietly. She shook her head, tears spilling down her face. "No, that's not what you think. Harry called me. He said you were going to rewrite your will, that he was manipulating you to cut me out entirely. I had to protect myself." The name hit me like a blow. "Harry called you?" I demanded. "When?" She hesitated, biting her lip, then said, "Yesterday morning. He said you'd been acting erratic again, that you were planning to move money offshore." He sounded worried. I thought maybe he was right about you needing supervision after all. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the fragile certainty I'd clung to, cracking open like thin ice. "Harry told you that?" I repeated. She nodded helplessly. "He said he wanted to help both of us." I turned away, trying to make sense of it. The storm outside roared louder, lightning flashing across the kitchen. Could it be true? Had I misjudged the one person who'd stood by me? Or was this just another lie in her endless arsenal? I told her to leave. She begged me to listen, insisting she had proof, that she could show me bank transfers made under my name, transfers she claimed Harry had initiated. I didn't want to believe her, but she opened her phone, scrolling through screenshots of transactions I didn't recognize. Small withdrawals, then larger ones, all dated within the past month. My name was there, my signature digital and flawless. I felt dizzy. "You're lying," I whispered. She handed me the phone. "Then check with the bank," she said softly. "You'll see." I didn't sleep that night. After she left, I sat by the kitchen window watching the storm fade into pale morning. At dawn, I drove to the bank, my mind spinning with suspicion and denial. The manager, who knew me from years of deposits and polite small talk, confirmed that several online transfers had indeed been made from my account to a firm registered under Harry Finn's name. My throat went dry. "It must be a mistake," I said, but he shook his head. "The authorization codes were correct." I left without speaking. By the time I reached home, my hands were trembling so violently I could barely fit the key into the lock. I called Harry, and when he answered, his voice was calm as ever. "Walter," he said, "I was going to explain everything today." My chest constricted. "Explain what?" He sighed, a long exhale heavy with something like regret. "You were right to suspect Evelyn, but you didn't realize how deep her debts ran. She borrowed money from people she shouldn't have. Dangerous people. I thought if I could move some of your funds temporarily, I could buy her time, stop them from coming after her. I was trying to protect you both." His words felt rehearsed, smooth, practiced, the same tone Evelyn used when she lied. "Without telling me?" I said. "Without consent?" He paused. "You wouldn't have agreed. You were too angry. I was going to return it after things settled. The rage that rose in me then wasn't sharp. It was cold, steady, absolute. "You used me," I said quietly. "Both of you." He said my name again, but I hung up. For a long time I just stood there, the phone in my hand, the house spinning slowly around me. I thought of all the people I had trusted, all the layers of deceit wrapped in the language of protection. I realized that I had been nothing more than a vessel for their fears, a resource to be mined, a signature to be forged, a father turned into a commodity. That evening I gathered every document, bank records, legal papers, the recordings, the photos, and placed them in a metal box. I drove to the edge of town, to the small lake where Margaret and I used to picnic in our younger years. The water was perfectly still, the surface reflecting the dim orange sky. I opened the box and looked through the papers one last time, feeling their weight like stones in my hands. Then I struck a match and dropped it inside. The flame caught quickly, licking the edges of the pages, curling the lies into ash. I watched until the last ember died, then pushed the smoldering remains into the lake with my foot. When I returned home, the phone was ringing. It was Evelyn again, her voice frantic, half sobbing. "Dad, I went to Harry's office. He's gone. His files, his computer, everything. They said he emptied his account this morning. I don't know what's happening." I listened silently, the final piece of truth settling into place. "Then now you know what it feels like," I said, and hung up. That night, I sat on the porch as the crickets started their slow chorus. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel anger or confusion or even sadness. What I felt was an almost terrifying calm, the kind that comes when every illusion has finally burned away. I realized that justice, in its purest form, isn't something granted by courts or laws. It's the moment when deception collapses under its own weight, when those who have manipulated you are left to face the emptiness they've created. I didn't know where Harry had gone, or what Evelyn would do next, but I knew that whatever came, I would meet it alone, unguarded and unbroken. Weeks have passed since the night everything came undone, and the quiet that now fills my house feels less like emptiness and more like a form of recovery, the slow unwinding of a long-held breath. The calls stopped. The legal notices stopped. Even the cameras, once blinking like nervous eyes in the corners, have been unplugged and boxed away. The silence has texture again. I can hear the rhythm of the refrigerator, the hum of the streetlight outside, the faint sigh of the wind through the eaves. The world, after so much noise, has finally gone still enough for me to think. Each morning I rise early, make coffee, and sit by the window where Margaret once kept her flowers. The geraniums have long since died, but I replace them with ivy that climbs toward the light in slow, patient arcs. Watching it grow has become a kind of prayer, a quiet act of persistence. Evelyn hasn't come back, though I sometimes see her car parked at the edge of town near the old gas station, as if she can't quite leave, but can no longer cross the distance between us. I don't call her, and she doesn't call me. Our silence has become its own conversation, one we both understand too well. I know she lost her job after the fraud investigation reopened. I know she's living alone now. A neighbor saw her once, thinner, older, carrying groceries in reusable bags like a penance. I should feel pity, maybe even the stirrings of forgiveness. But what I feel instead is a weary recognition of limits. There are wounds that forgiveness cannot close without reopening everything that came before. Sometimes love means letting the door remain shut. As for Harry, he vanished completely. His office was cleared out within a day, his phone disconnected, his name removed from the state registry. The police called me twice for questioning, polite but cautious, asking whether I had noticed any unusual behavior or missing funds. I told them the truth as far as I knew it, that I had trusted him, that he had saved me, that he had betrayed me, and that I had no desire to chase ghosts. They seemed satisfied with that. Later, a letter arrived from a post office in another state. No return address, only my name written in his precise, slanted handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. You were right about both of us. Take care of yourself. Nothing more. I burned it in the sink without reading it again. People ask, when they see me in town, if I'm doing better. I say yes, though the word feels too small for what survival really means. Better is a relative thing. It means I can sleep through the night without hearing invisible footsteps, that I can read without scanning the corners of the page for hidden traps, that I can walk through my own house without wondering who once stood where I stand now. Sometimes I drive to the lake and sit on the bench overlooking the water. The air there smells of pine and damp earth, and if I close my eyes, I can almost hear Margaret's laughter, soft and amused, as if she's somewhere just out of sight. I speak to her often now, not as memory, but as witness. I tell her what happened, how her daughter and I both failed to understand, that love without trust is only a form of control, how we mistook protection for possession, and how easily good intentions can rot into cruelty when left unchecked. One morning not long ago, I received a small envelope with no name, just the words "for Dad" scrawled across the front in a shaky hand. Inside was a short note. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just hope you're still alive. There was no signature, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. For a long time I sat there at the table, the sunlight spilling across the paper, and I felt something strange, neither forgiveness nor bitterness, but a kind of fragile peace. She was alive. That was enough. Whatever else might come was no longer mine to shape. I've made new arrangements for the house. I hired a local attorney to rewrite my will, leaving the property to a scholarship fund for the school where I taught. The rest will go to the local library and the community garden Margaret once volunteered for. I've written no letters to Evelyn about it. The inheritance she sought so ruthlessly will go instead to children she'll never meet. And I think there's a quiet justice in that. A cycle closed not by revenge, but by redirection. In the evenings, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the sun set over the maples across the street. The light shifts from gold to copper to the color of old coins. And in that fading glow, I see something that feels almost like redemption. Not the kind found in apologies or reconciliations, but the quieter kind that arrives when you stop demanding explanations from the world. I am old now, and I know there are fewer days ahead than behind. But I've learned that survival is not endurance. It's acceptance. It's the moment when you realize that what was taken from you no longer defines you. That peace is not the absence of betrayal, but the decision to live beyond it. Sometimes, when the wind changes, I hear a faint knock on the porch rail, as if Margaret's hand still rests there, tapping gently to remind me that life continues, imperfect and unresolved. And I think of the words I wrote in my journal the morning after I came home from the hospital. Better to live alone in truth than surrounded by the comfort of lies. I understand those words differently now. Alone is not punishment. It is clarity. It is the last gift time gives to those who have survived the worst others could do to them. And so each morning begins the same way. The kettle hissing, the quiet creak of the chair, the slow spill of a light across the table. The world outside carries on. Cars passing, dogs barking, someone's child laughing in the distance. And I sit here, breathing, unhurried, unguarded, and finally, unmistakably free.